The temperature in the forward trenches was just above freezing. It was 2 hours past midnight on a ridgeline of dense, shattered timber, obliterating an already ruined stone wall near an empty dirt crossroads. The blast echoed down the valley, fading into the steady sound of the freezing rain. At 1:15 in the morning, a single gunner would adjust his elevation handwheel, load a single high-explosive shell, and pull the lanyard. One round would scream out toward a crossroad. At 1:40, a different gun would fire a single round at a supply track. Another round would hit a rear assembly area at 2:12. The schedule was deliberately randomized. There was no rhythm, no escalating crescendo, and no warning. This system was incredibly efficient. To obliterate a reinforced concrete bunker required hundreds of shells, a clear line of sight, and precise mathematical adjustments. But to deny the use of a 2-mile stretch of road for an entire night, an artillery battery only needed to drop 20 random shells along its length. A supply truck driver in a soft-skinned vehicle, carrying hot food or fresh water, will not drive down a dark road if he knows artillery is falling on it at unpredictable intervals. The sheer mathematical chance of driving into a blast zone is enough to halt the convoy. The road remains physically intact, but tactically it ceases to exist. The officers in the dry command tent were fighting a war of logistics and psychology, manipulating the environment to ensure the opposing force could never relax, never resupply, and never safely gather. The map made perfect theoretical sense. But a doctrine is just an idea until it is executed against a living target. Another 35 minutes passed in silence. The silence itself became a heavy, physical presence in the dark. Then, a third shell fell near a grove. To understand how a few isolated explosions could paralyze the command structure of an entire veteran battalion, we have to look at the fragile, physical threads those single shells were quietly destroying in the dark. Down in the freezing mud behind the ridgeline, the most vital piece of technology was not a machine gun or a tank. It was a thin, black strand of rubber-coated copper unspooled across the dirt. For a mid-century infantry battalion to function, it relied on miles of field telephone wire, hastily strung through tree branches and dragged through waterlogged trenches. These wires connected the frontline platoons to the company commanders and the companies to the battalion command post. They were the nervous system of the defense. They were also incredibly fragile. When a random shell detonated in an empty clearing, at 2 in the morning, the men in the nearby foxholes thought it was a wasted shot. It had hit nothing but dirt and pine needles, but the blast wave sent hundreds of jagged, red-hot steel fragments tearing through the brush at supersonic speeds. One piece of shrapnel, no larger than a coin, of splintered trees where absolutely nothing was stationed. To the junior officers and the riflemen huddled in the freezing mud, this made no sense. Sliced through the black casing of the signal wire suspended between 2 trees. Instantly, the phone in the forward dugout went dead. The physical line was severed. Under normal combat conditions, a signalman would immediately trace the line, find the break, strip the copper ends, and splice them back together. It was a 10-minute job, but under harassment and interdiction fire, the signalman knew that leaving his trench meant stepping into a lethal lottery. He knew the enemy guns were firing blindly, but he did not know when the next round would fall. Driven by basic human preservation, he delayed the repair. He waited in his hole. The 10-minute job took 4 hours. This was the geography of friction. The artillery was not targeting the armor, it was targeting the seams of the organization. Half a mile away, a heavily loaded 2.5-ton truck rumbled in the dark, carrying wooden crates of mortar ammunition and insulated steel cans of hot coffee. As it approached a muddy crossroads, A single 75mm shell screamed out of the overcast sky and impacted a few hundred yards down the route. The blast did not touch the truck. It did not crater the road. It was a failure of basic gunnery. The enemy battery was clearly firing blind, wasting heavy 75mm ammunition on empty earth. But the driver immediately slammed on the brakes, pulled into the tree line, and killed the engine. The driver was not a coward. He was a rational man evaluating an incalculable risk. He knew that driving a soft-skinned vehicle filled with explosives into an active, unpredictable artillery zone was suicidal. He decided to wait until the shelling stopped. But the shelling was not designed to stop. It was designed to linger. By spending just one high-explosive shell every half hour, the enemy battery achieved a massive tactical victory. They did not have to destroy the truck, kill the driver, or vaporize the cargo. The threat alone achieved the exact same result. The truck stayed parked in the trees. The mortar ammunition and the hot coffee did not reach the shivering men on the ridgeline. 50 concentrated shells dropped directly onto a reinforced concrete pillbox might kill a dozen entrenched defenders. But a single shell, perfectly timed at a muddy junction, starves an entire battalion. By dawn, the network of black wires lay in shredded pieces across the hillside, and the supply trucks were backed up for miles in the rear. The infantrymen in the forward fighting positions were physically untouched, but they were now an island, severed from the rear echelon, abandoned structures, and dark dirt roads. The men in the forward line felt a grim sense of relief. As the sun rose, the battalion commander, sitting in his deep, heavily protected dugout, cranked the handle of his field telephone, only to hear static. He was perfectly safe from the shrapnel, but he had just lost his eyes and his voice. To understand how that silence destroyed the unit without a shot being fired, we must look at what happens when a commander can no longer reach his own men. Inside the battalion command post, the air was thick with the smell of damp wool, stale cigarette smoke, and kerosene. The battalion commander held the dead telephone receiver to his ear. When the wire network fails, doctrine dictates a primitive but reliable backup: the human runner. The commander drafted a simple handwritten order on a slip of paper, instructing his forward companies to report their ammunition levels and consolidate their defensive sectors. He handed the paper to a young private, who tucked it inside his wet jacket and climbed the wooden stairs out of the deep bunker. When the runner breached the surface, he was greeted by the freezing rain and a heavy, oppressive silence. He began to sprint up the reverse slope, navigating by memory toward the frontline positions. 3 minutes into his run, the distant, unmistakable thud of a heavy gun echoed through the valley. The runner did what he was trained to do. He dove face first into the freezing mud. Their deep fighting positions were perfectly safe from these scattered, erratic impacts. The enemy was failing to destroy them. The shells screamed over the ridgeline and detonated in the woods half a mile away. The runner was perfectly safe. But as he lay in the dirt, his heart hammering against his ribs, he realized he had no idea when the next round would arrive. It could be in 10 seconds, or it could be in an hour. To stand up and run was to bet his life on an invisible, incalculable timetable. So, the runner stayed flat against the earth. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The paper order remained tucked inside his jacket, slowly soaking through with cold water, entirely unread. This exact scenario repeated itself across the entire sector. Platoon runners, company messengers, and medical orderlies found themselves pinned to the ground by the sheer psychological weight of anticipation. The command structure had not been physically crushed, but it had been completely dismantled. Back in the dugout, the commander stared at his tactical map under the dim light of a kerosene lantern. Under normal combat conditions, That map was a living document, constantly updated with fresh intelligence, casualty reports, and enemy movements. Now, it was a piece of historical fiction. The commander did not know if his left flank was holding. He did not know if his heavy machine guns had enough ammunition to repel an assault. He could not order his reserve platoon to plug a gap. This pattern continued for 48 hours. The shells fell at entirely unpredictable intervals, sometimes 10 minutes apart, sometimes an hour and a half. Because he could not know if a gap existed, he was a brain entirely severed from its nervous system. The battalion had been functionally neutralized without a single enemy infantryman crossing the wire. If a major ground assault had materialized at that exact moment, the defending force would not have responded as a unified, coordinated machine. They would have fought as hundreds of isolated, terrified individuals, completely unable to call for artillery support, shift their lines, or request reinforcements. The enemy system had achieved a mobility kill on the entire chain of command. Yet, the true horror of harassment and interdiction fire was not just what it did to the officers staring at silent radios in the rear echelon. The physical paralysis of the battalion was only half the objective. To fully break the combat effectiveness of a veteran unit, the artillery system had to penetrate the minds of the men trapped in the center of the target zone. While the commander struggled with the silence of his communications, the infantrymen, huddled in the forward trenches, were fighting an internal battle against time, darkness, and their own biology. The physical damage was minimal, but what happens to the human brain when it is forced to endure 48 hours of lethal unpredictability, entirely deprived of the one biological function it needs to cope with terror? They rarely landed in the same place twice. They never concentrated into a devastating wall of fire. By the standard mathematical metrics of war, the human brain can endure extraordinary violence, provided that violence has a clear beginning and a defined end. During a concentrated, destructive artillery barrage, the nervous system floods with adrenaline. The soldier curls into the dirt, gripping his weapon, existing in a state of absolute, hyper-focused survival. When the barrage finally lifts, the sudden absence of noise triggers a biological crash. The exhausted body shuts down, allowing the brain to enter deep, restorative sleep. It is a harsh cycle, but it is a predictable one. Harassment and interdiction fire weaponize this exact biological mechanism by preventing the crash. Down in the waterlogged foxholes, the men had been awake for nearly 40 hours. Every time the distant thump of an enemy gun echoed through the freezing rain, their bodies executed an involuntary chemical response. Heart rate spiked, cortisol flooded their bloodstreams, muscles locked rigid in anticipation of the blast. Then, the shell would detonate hundreds of yards away, hitting an empty road or a patch of mud. The threat passed, but the adrenaline remained in their veins. As the silence stretched from 10 minutes into 20, the exhausted soldiers would slowly loosen their grip on their rifles. Their breathing would shallow out. Their eyelids, heavy with fatigue, would finally close. The brain desperately tried to slip into the first stage of sleep. The veteran unit was winning this exchange. After 2 days and 2 nights of continuous but scattered shelling, their physical casualties were incredibly low. Then, without warning, the sky would tear open again. Another random blast, another violent spike of adrenaline, another aborted attempt to rest. This was not a test of courage. It was a mechanical destruction of the nervous system. Medical officers observing combat fatigue understood that a soldier's psychological endurance is a finite battery. By forcing the human body to endure 50 separate adrenaline spikes in a single night without the release of sustained sleep, the interdiction fire literally broke the chemical balance of the brain. The men stopped tracking time. Some began to experience auditory hallucinations, hearing the shrieking of incoming shells during the long stretches of absolute, freezing silence. Others developed involuntary tremors, shaking violently despite being wrapped in dry blankets. This was the true nature of shell shock under an interdiction mission. A massive, concentrated bombardment physically crushes a unit, but the sheer, relentless unpredictability of single, scattered rounds dismantles the mind. The men were not afraid of the explosion itself. They were being driven mad by the waiting. The silence between the shells became more agonizing than the noise, because the silence was simply an invisible countdown to the next randomized impact. By the second night, the battalion was practically catatonic. Almost every rifleman was alive and uninjured. Their machine guns were operational. Their anti-tank weapons were completely intact beneath their tarps. The veterans who had survived heavy combat operations just weeks prior were now sitting in their dugouts, staring blankly at the dirt walls, entirely unresponsive to their surroundings. They had not bled, but they were casualties. They were incapable of operating a radio, aiming a rifle, or walking in a straight line. But a logical question remains. These were experienced soldiers. Once they realized the enemy was firing a scattered, mathematically improbable pattern, why did they not simply adapt? If the chances of a random shell hitting a specific foxhole were statistically near zero, why could the unit not just accept the minimal risk, ignore the noise, sleep in shifts, and wait out the bombardment? To understand why the battalion could not simply ignore the fire, we have to look at how their own defensive instincts ultimately sealed the trap. The instinct of any infantryman under fire is to seek the earth. When steel falls from the sky, survival dictates digging deeper, packing more dirt over the timber, and shrinking the human silhouette. The veterans on the ridgeline were experts at this mechanic of survival. They knew exactly how to reinforce their fighting positions to withstand the kinetic energy of high explosives. The infantrymen in the fighting positions had dug down 3 feet into the root-choked soil, layered their foxholes with thick pine logs, and waited. The enemy artillery had failed to achieve a single catastrophic hit on a major bunker. The men survived because they stayed in their holes. As the randomized interdiction fire continued into its second day, the men reacted with the only logical defense they had ever been taught. They anchored themselves to the ground. They refused to leave the deep, muddy cover of their foxholes. This was the trap. By doing exactly what their survival instincts and their training demanded, the battalion voluntarily completed the enemy's objective. They believed they were outlasting the bombardment. They believed that by staying hidden, they were rendering the enemy artillery useless and winning a war of attrition. But from the perspective of the enemy officers miles away in the dry command tent, the defensive reaction was the entire point of the operation. The opposing force was not trying to blow the veterans out of the ground. They were using the artillery to lock them inside it. A heavily fortified bunker is only a tactical asset if the men inside it can shoot, communicate, and maneuver. If the men are trapped inside by the sheer unpredictability of the shelling, the bunker ceases to be a defensive strongpoint. It becomes a cage. If the veteran battalion had simply stood up, ignored the random shells, and accepted the mathematical probability of a few casualties, they could have re-established their severed wire communications. They could have brought up the hot food from the valley. They could have maintained their combat readiness. Yet, when the sun rose on the third morning, something inexplicable had happened to the battalion. But human psychology does not work on cold mathematics. A soldier cannot be ordered to simply ignore a 75mm high-explosive shell tearing through the trees, even if the statistical chance of it hitting him is 1 in 1,000. The mind registers the violent blast. The body involuntarily floods with adrenaline, and the man stays in the hole. Because they stayed in their holes, they surrendered their mobility. Because they surrendered their mobility, they ceased to exist as a threat on the operational map. If an enemy infantry regiment had wanted to bypass this ridgeline, they could have done so with almost complete impunity. The defenders were too paralyzed by the unpredictable shelling to mount a coordinated counterattack. They could not even look over their own parapets long enough to spot an advancing force. The interdiction fire had effectively placed the entire defensive line in a state of suspended animation. The enemy had achieved a massive operational advantage without having to spend the blood, time, and logistical tonnage required for a direct frontal assault. The veterans had played by the old rules of destruction. They measured their success by the fact that their heavy logs remained unbroken and their bodies remained whole. But they failed to realize that the rules of the engagement had fundamentally changed. The enemy was not fighting a war of destruction, they were fighting a war of friction. Without a single enemy infantryman crossing the wire, and without suffering any mass casualties, the unit had structurally collapsed. This fundamental misunderstanding forces us to re-evaluate how we measure a battlefield victory. If an artillery battery fires scattered rounds for 48 hours, kills almost no one, and shatters no concrete, the traditional after-action report might record it as a failure. But as the sun set on the final day of the bombardment, the true metric of the artillery's success was not found in the crater count, but in what the silence finally revealed. When the guns finally stopped on the morning of the third day, the silence was not a relief. It was a heavy, suspicious void. On the ridgeline, the veteran infantrymen did not immediately climb out of their foxholes. They sat in the freezing mud, gripping their rifles, their eyes fixed on the splintered tree canopy. They were waiting for the single, unpredictable, high-explosive shell that would restart the cycle. The timber roofs above their heads were intact. Their machine guns were oiled and ready. Their bodies were largely unscarred by shrapnel. Yet the battalion was completely combat ineffective. The question was never really about the kinetic destruction of reinforced concrete or the physical annihilation of a defensive line. It was about the invisible biological and logistical machinery that turns 1,000 individual men into a functioning military unit. The frontline soldiers and junior officers, when the command post attempted to order a tactical shift in the line, the companies could not coordinate. The field telephones were dead, had believed they were surviving a failed bombardment because they measured survival by the old rules of war. They looked at the empty craters in the woods and saw wasted ammunition. But the enemy artillery commanders had not missed their targets. They had aimed at something much more fragile than armor. They had aimed at sleep, at hydration, at the delivery of hot rations, and at the thin copper wires that carried human voices in the dark. They proved that an army's greatest vulnerability is not its heavy equipment, but its absolute reliance on the mundane rhythms of human maintenance. You do not need to vaporize a truck to stop it from driving down a road. You only need to make the driver believe the road is lethal. You do not need to physically destroy a command post. You only need to trap the runners in the mud and sever the field telephones. A destroyed unit leaves behind shattered bunkers and burning vehicles. A paralyzed unit leaves behind a perfectly intact battlefield, occupied by men who can no longer move. This invisible system of paralysis was not a natural phenomenon. It was constructed by deliberate human labor. Miles behind the line, unseen artillery officers sat under kerosene lanterns. Runners sent between platoons never returned. Men who had not suffered a single scratch sat in their flooded holes, shivering uncontrollably, drafting mathematical timetables of friction. Unnamed gunners stood in the freezing rain, fighting their own exhaustion, checking their watches to load a single shell into a breach at 2 in the morning. They built a mechanical clockwork designed strictly to dismantle the human nervous system. The true cost of that system was paid by the men trapped inside the grid. It was paid by the supply clerks, shivering in parked trucks, the medics pinned in their dugouts, the signalmen staring at severed wires they could not fix, and the infantrymen drinking filthy water from the bottom of their trenches. They survived the steel, but they were broken by the silence, in between the explosions. Long after the front lines shifted and the heavy artillery batteries were towed away, the physical landscape recovered. The craters filled with rainwater, and the shattered trees began to rot into the soil. But for the veterans who walked away from that ridgeline, the bombardment never entirely ended. Decades after the war, a sudden clap of thunder, a slamming door, or an unexpected interval of absolute silence would cause a veteran to freeze, completely incapable of processing a basic verbal command. They could not maneuver. They could not resupply. They were physically intact. In that split second, his heart rate would spike, his breath would catch, and his mind would instantly return to a waterlogged hole in the earth, waiting for the unpredictable arrival of a single shell that was always just about to fall. But they were paralyzed and exhausted as a cohesive military force. To understand how a physically unharmed unit could simply disintegrate on the battlefield, we first have to understand the fundamental rules of survival these soldiers believed they were following, and what they assumed a falling shell was actually designed to do. In the established doctrine of the mid-20th century, artillery was understood primarily as an instrument of industrial demolition. For the men holding the front line, the rules of a bombardment were grim but mathematically predictable. They were veterans. They knew the mechanical rhythm of a modern artillery barrage. They knew that a heavy bombardment began with a distant, synchronized thud. A professional artillery strike began with a forward observer, identifying a hard target, a concrete pillbox, a machine gun nest, or an armored assembly area. The observer would radio the coordinates to the rear, and a single gun would fire a spotting round. The men in the trenches would see the grey smoke of that first impact, usually falling short or wide. Then came the correction. The next shell would land closer, adjusting for wind, elevation, and the temperature of the propellant powder. This was the terrifying geometry of the bracket. Once the observer had the target trapped between a short round and a long round, they would call for the entire battery to fire for effect. This was the old rule of survival. The sky would suddenly tear open. Dozens of high-explosive shells, fitted with point-detonating fuses, would hammer a concentrated grid square in a matter of minutes. The goal was pure, physical annihilation. The overlapping shockwaves were designed to cave in bunkers, shatter heavy engine blocks, and instantly neutralize a defending force through overwhelming kinetic energy. To survive this type of concentrated destruction, infantrymen were trained in a very specific set of defensive behaviors. They learned to dig deep, narrow foxholes that minimized their exposure to horizontally flying shrapnel. They learned to cut heavy timber, stack sandbags, and pack earth to create thick, overhead cover. A shrieking arrival, a violent upheaval of dirt, and then the methodical, terrifying adjustment of fire as the enemy spotters closed the bracket around the target, protecting themselves from deadly tree bursts. They knew that a destructive barrage was a furious, intensely violent, but time-limited event. The artillery would expend a massive amount of ammunition in a short window to maximize shock, and then the barrage would lift. The moment the shelling shifted to the rear, the survivors knew they had only seconds to climb out of the mud, clear the dirt from their rifle bolts, and face the advancing ground assault. It was a brutal contest of physics, but it made logical sense. The enemy spent steel to destroy positions, and the defenders used earth to survive it. But the sporadic, single shells falling on the current ridgeline completely violated this doctrine of mass and concentration. By the military mathematics of the era, a single high-explosive round fired blindly into a forested hillside has almost zero probability of killing a dug-in soldier. It takes hundreds of concentrated rounds to guarantee the physical destruction of a properly entrenched platoon. Hauling heavy artillery ammunition to the front was a massive logistical burden. Firing one shell an hour, without adjustment, without a forward observer calling for effect, seemed doctrinally absurd. According to every manual on destructive fire, the enemy was throwing away precious logistics. The single rounds were simply cratering empty mud, but that was not happening tonight. A single, heavy shell tore through the low clouds and detonated 300 yards behind the front line, and snapping tree branches in completely unoccupied sectors. They were not collapsing the heavy bunkers. They were not crushing the anti-tank guns. If the objective was to clear the ridgeline for an infantry breakthrough, the enemy artillery commander was failing completely. The physical defenses of the battalion remained entirely intact, but that logical conclusion relied on a fatal assumption. It assumed that the enemy was actually trying to break the concrete, the timber, and the steel. It assumed the target was the heavily armored front line itself. To understand why the veteran battalion was quietly disintegrating despite surviving the blasts, we have to look past the heavily fortified foxholes and examine what happens to the human body when the mundane, invisible lifelines of basic survival are methodically severed in the dark. The temperature inside a waterlogged foxhole drops dramatically when the human body stops moving. By the 12th hour of the bombardment, the veterans on the ridgeline faced a biological crisis that steel and timber could not solve. Their canteens were empty. The battalion's water point was only 200 yards down the reverse slope, a 5-minute walk under normal conditions. But under this specific type of shelling, that short distance became an impassable void. If the enemy had fired somewhere along the muddy supply track leading down the reverse slope, the ground trembled, sending loose dirt spilling over the edges of the foxholes. Concentrated barrage for 30 minutes. The men would have endured the impacts, waited for the guns to fall silent, and then safely walked down the hill. A predictable schedule allows a soldier to calculate risk, but the randomized firing rhythm removed that calculation. A shell had landed 10 minutes ago. Was the next one coming in 30 seconds or 2 hours? To leave the deep cover of the foxhole with empty canteens meant walking, upright across exposed ground, gambling against an invisible stopwatch controlled by a firing battery miles away. Because the risk of stepping into a random blast was too high, the men stayed in their holes. And because they stayed in their holes, the mundane mechanics of human survival began to collapse. Men began drinking the muddy, freezing water pooling at the bottom of their trenches. Within 24 hours, the lack of clean water and hot food began to degrade their physical strength. The field kitchens in the rear could not bring up hot rations because the supply trucks could not risk the unpredictable explosions on the access roads. The men instinctively covered their necks, gripping the cold stocks of their rifles, and waited for the second shell. The frontline troops were forced to survive on cold, dense combat rations, which their dehydrated bodies struggled to digest. The degradation accelerated with basic hygiene. A soldier cannot safely walk to a latrine trench when the perimeter is under sporadic fire. The men were forced to relieve themselves in empty ration tins or directly into the mud of their own fighting positions. In freezing temperatures, surrounded by their own waste, standing in ankle-deep water they could not bail out for fear of exposing their silhouettes. The risk of dysentery and trench foot skyrocketed. Their muscles cramped, their core temperatures plummeted. The timber roofs above them remained unbroken, but the human machinery beneath the logs was failing. Furthermore, the random impacts made physical assembly impossible. Platoon sergeants could not walk the line to check on their men, distribute ammunition, or inspect for frostbite. A squad leader huddled in one dugout had no way of knowing if the dugout, men in the hole 30 feet away, were awake or freezing to death. Minor injuries went untreated because medics could not safely cross the open ground. The unit was no longer a cohesive fighting force. It had been splintered into. They waited for the cluster of high explosives that would walk the fire forward into their positions. They waited in absolute silence for 22 minutes. Dozens of isolated, shivering pockets of men cut off from mutual support. The enemy artillery had not struck a single bunker, yet it had effectively severed the infantry from their water, their food, and their cohesion. The men were rotting in place, trapped by the mathematical uncertainty of the next shell. The officers observing this physical decay assumed it was a tragic byproduct of an inaccurate bombardment. They still believed the opposing force was trying to hit them and missing. To understand why that assumption was entirely backward, we must look at the maps pinned to the walls of the enemy artillery command posts and examine the deliberate doctrine designed to inflict exactly this type of paralysis. Miles behind the freezing ridgeline, inside a dry, blacked-out command tent, enemy artillery officers were not looking at the frontline bunkers. They were looking at a topographical map overlaid with a grid of intersecting red lines. The officers were not frustrated by their failure to destroy the opposing infantry. In fact, they were executing a highly sophisticated mathematical system that was working exactly as designed. This was the doctrine of harassment and interdiction, known in artillery manuals as H&I fire. Then, a second shell arrived. It did not land anywhere near the first. It impacted far to the left. H&I fire was built on a radical premise. You do not need to kill an enemy soldier to remove him from the battle. You only need to dictate his behavior. A destructive mission requires precise intelligence, forward observers, and massive ammunition expenditure to physically crush a fortified target. Interdiction fire requires none of these. Instead of targeting men and concrete, this doctrine targets geography and time. The officers in the tent analyzed the map like engineers studying a plumbing system. They searched for the arteries that kept the front line alive. A narrow dirt road winding through a steep valley, a small wooden bridge over a stream, a flat clearing behind a ridge that was perfectly suited for a field kitchen. These were not defensive hardpoints. They were transit nodes. The officers understood that an entrenched infantry battalion consumes thousands of pounds of supplies every day: water, rations, medical tape, radio batteries, and ammunition must constantly flow forward. To survive, the battalion has to move. Once these geographic bottlenecks were identified, the artillery staff created a master timetable. Out on the firing line, the gun crews were not sweating through a frantic, rapid-fire barrage. They were resting and checking their watches.